Hi guys, welcome. Today we're going to be working on air pressure, something we may have discussed already in class, but today we're going to be focusing on the differences between generally high and generally low air pressure for our atmosphere and the impact that that tends to have on our weather and climate patterns. So first things first, we know that the closer we are to sea level, in comparison to being at high elevation or high altitude, we tend to have higher pressure. And that's because that column of air that we discussed, right, this column of air here, this invisible column of air, tends to, because of gravity, end up with higher air density towards the bottom. This image shows it pretty well, how the little molecules of air are more spaced apart at higher altitude. This is actually why it's harder to breathe at high elevation, because since gravity is acting upon these particles less, they're further away from Earth, then they are more spaced out, they are under lower pressure, so they are less squeezed together. So I try to take a breath at high elevation, the oxygen particles are just too far apart for me to get enough of it, or at least in comparison to what's going on at sea level. This chart on the right is nothing that you need to copy. This is just basically driving home the idea that the higher the pressure, the clearer the skies. Now, a lot of us like to think, okay, well, warm weather is good weather. Well, I like to say high and dry, so that's dry weather, so clear weather for high pressure, and low is lousy. So lousy would be bad weather. Now, I know a lot of us think warm weather is good, but actually in the case of air pressure tends to be that the highest air pressure is associated with cold and dry, or cool and dry air. Okay, so what's going on here? So as the weather gets worse, the pressure tends to go down. This is just what we were just driving home a moment ago: high and dry, low and lousy. When storms and fronts come into areas, they are associated with low pressures. Now, this term fronts is a very loaded term, because in a few classes from now, we're going to be talking lots about fronts and what that means. But for now, what you need to think of is, if bad weather's a coming, then that means we're going to have barometric pressure decreasing. This is the normal range, the normal accepted range for air pressures on Earth. There have been air pressures at the center or the eye of some very powerful hurricanes that have been below this number of 951. But generally speaking, it falls in this range. Okay, so this last bit at the bottom here is just telling us that as density, or as air density increases, air pressure increases. So when we talk about air density, that's how tightly packed the particles are of the atmosphere. When that's high, then we also have high pressure. Direct relationship, because as one goes up, the other goes up. Okay, this is something you definitely need in your notes, so please go ahead and create this chart in your notes. Pause the video as you need to. All right, so high and low. I'm gonna give you a nice image for high and low, so you can copy this chart, but the H and L, you'll see. I'm gonna project an image in just a moment. Okay, so wind direction. Let's start with that. For high pressure, we tend to have clockwise winds surrounding the high, and I'm gonna show you what that looks like in an image in a moment. We also have air moving away from the high. Now, if you remember, probably from last year, you may have learned that diffusion is the concept of a substance moving from high to low concentration, right? We spray something in one side of the room, we will start smelling that on the other side of the room over time as it diffuses from high to low. Now, air does the same thing, and we call this wind, the movement of air from a higher to a lower pressure. So that's why we say outwards, away from the high. It's moving away. The air moves away from high and towards low. Direction, this should make some sense, because high pressure is associated with sinking air, so that's going to mean that the air is moving downwards vertically. So in other words, from up high in the atmosphere downward when we have high pressure. Humidity low, this is what we said before, high and dry, and the associated weather is going to be clear skies, tending to be sunny and cool. This is a very important concept clear weather, dry weather, cold weather, all associated with high pressure. Okay, low pressure. Low pressure is going to, of course, be the reverse. Now, instead of winds moving in a clockwise fashion as it moves away from the high, instead, for low pressure, wind is going to move counterclockwise in and towards the low. Again, we're going to show you in just a moment what that should look like. The way I like to remember this is high clocks, low counters. In other words, high is associated with clockwise, low is associated with counterclockwise. And actually, this can be a way to remember it because clocks often are high on the wall, and counters, so something you'd put your bag down on or your beverage, would be down on a counter. Okay, wind direction vertical. Of course, if high pressure means we have sinking air, then low pressure means we have rising air. Humidity, when we have low humidity, that's associated with high pressure, and when we have high humidity, that's associated with low. And of course, associated weather then is probably not good, right? High pressure means high and dry, clear weather, nice day, or low humidity, and then low pressure is going to mean the reverse. Here's what I mean with this image of the high and the low, okay? Let's zoom in. Around a high pressure system, we should have winds moving away from the high, as we said. But notice as they move away, they actually are going to turn or bend to the outside. Now, this is actually due to something called the Coriolis effect. They bend in this manner due to the rotation of the Earth. This is a concept we will get into a little deeper at a later time. But what you need to know how to do, and what you need to do right now in your notes, is to draw these arrows. So draw an H, draw the arrows moving out and away in a, notice, clockwise fashion. Whereas the low should have air rushing in towards it, winds rushing in towards the low, right? From high to low, diffusion, in a counterclockwise motion, in a counterclockwise turning fashion. Again, why this is the case, we'll get into it another time, but make no mistake that you need to be an expert in drawing this. The Regents loves to ask questions of this nature with you practicing drawing the winds around a high or a low pressure. The low could be a nice example of a low would be like a tornado or a hurricane, because those are terrible weather. They have low pressure at the center, and winds will go in them in this fashion, move around them in this fashion. This is the sideways view showing the vertical movement of air around a high or a low. Notice the high, we have sinking air, and then it moves away. Whereas the low, we have air getting pulled in towards the low and then rising. We have clear weather for the high, and we have stormy or cloudy weather for the low. Now, just another image of sort of the same thing, but this gives you a more 3D image. I know this is a little pixelated. I apologize for that. This is supposed to be a city, but what we're showing here is that around the high, we have clockwise and outwards, clockwise and outwards, clockwise and outwards, sinking. Low pressure, rising air, bad weather, counterclockwise and inward. You need to know this stuff. All right. Have a nice day.